On October 14th, 2000, a storm raged over Lexington County, South Carolina. Lightning slashed the sky above Lake Murray, and rain pounded the lonely road like iron nails. At 11, VU0P, M. A trucker caught a glimpse through his windshield. A silver Ford Taurus tearing through the downpour. Another pair of headlights locked behind it. Too close. Too deliberate. Minutes later, 19-year-old Ashley Monroe, a freshman at the University of South Carolina, made a frantic call to her best friend. Her trembling voice carried only a few words. "Someone's following me." Then came the screech of metal, a strangled cry, and silence. The line went dead, swallowed by the storm. By dawn, her bed at home was untouched, her phone unanswered. Along the lakeside road, police found a shattered cell phone glowing weakly in the mud, tire tracks swerving toward the water, and a single white Nike shoe, fresh, small, and unmistakably Ashley's. Helicopters combed the shoreline. Divers plunged into black water. But Lake Murray offered nothing back. No body. No car. Only silence. And silence has power. In the days that followed, suspicion spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered, newspapers screamed, and police chased shadows. An innocent man's life was destroyed by rumors, while the real predator stayed hidden in plain sight. This case would not fade. 2 years later, a brown package appeared in the Monroe family mailbox. Inside lay Ashley's silver bracelet, caked in mud, reeking of oil, like a message from the darkness. I'm still here. For over 2 decades, this community lived under that shadow, until one detective reopened the file and forced the lake to finally reveal its secret. A rusted car, a navy blue jacket never made public, and a clue marked with 2 simple letters changed everything. This is not just a disappearance. It is one of America's most haunting true crime cases, a storm, a lake, and a neighbor who lived 2 houses away. Subscribe now, stay with us, and don't let Lake Murray's silence bury the truth again. The storm did not ease. By midnight, Lake Murray's shoreline had become a graveyard of noise, wind snapping through the trees, rain beating on the asphalt in endless sheets, and thunder rolling across the hills like artillery fire. In the middle of it all, Ashley Monroe gripped the wheel of her silver Ford Taurus. She was 19, barely out of high school, still adjusting to the rhythm of college life. That night, she had left a study session with friends in Columbia, promising her parents she would be home before midnight. Witnesses later described the highway that night as a tunnel of rain. The windshield wipers moved frantically, barely keeping pace. Every passing streetlight blurred into streaks of white. Yet what unsettled Ashley most was not the storm. It was the car behind her. A set of headlights had appeared in her rearview mirror miles earlier. At first, she brushed it off as coincidence. Plenty of drivers used the same route. But as the minutes passed, the lights never faded. They stayed fixed, too close, mirroring her every turn. Picture yourself behind that wheel. Your pulse quickens as the glass fogs with your breath. You press harder on the gas, only to see the lights press forward too, refusing to let go. The mirror no longer shows distance. It shows threat. Ashley dialed her best friend, Kelly. Through static and the roar of rain, her voice cracked with fear. "Someone's following me." Kelly tried to calm her, straining to catch each broken syllable. Then came the screech of twisting metal, the sharp sound of impact, and finally a scream cut short. The line went silent. For Kelly, the call was like being trapped on the other side of glass. She dialed back over and over, but the phone only rang into emptiness. At that same moment, a truck driver along Highway 6 reported seeing two cars, one silver, one dark, veering dangerously close, almost colliding before disappearing around the bend near the lake. He remembered the storm, the roar of engines, and the way the taillights vanished into the curtain of rain. By dawn, the Monroe household was gripped by dread. Mrs. Monroe stepped onto the porch at 6 a.m., expecting to see her daughter's car in the driveway. Instead, the yard was empty, silent but for the drip of rainwater from the roof. Panic spread quickly. Mr. Monroe dialed Ashley's phone again and again, each ring unanswered. By 7, the call was made to police. Deputies responded within the hour. Their patrol cars cut through the wet roads, red and blue lights reflecting in puddles. They traced Ashley's usual route from Columbia, scanning the roadside for signs. Oh, then they saw it. Fragments of plastic and glass scattered near a bend. A phone lay face down in the mud, its shattered screen still pulsing faintly as if clinging to life. Beside it, deep tire tracks curved wildly toward the embankment, gouged into the sodden earth. They didn't match the Taurus. The grooves were too wide, suggesting another vehicle, larger, heavier, had been there too. Closer to the shoreline, half buried in muck, a volunteer later found a white Nike shoe. It was barely worn, the kind of sneaker a 19-year-old would buy for classes and campus walks. Mrs. Monroe identified it instantly, collapsing as she clutched it to her chest. The scene was enough to mobilize the county. Within 12 hours, 100 volunteers gathered at Lake Murray's edge. Search dogs sniffed the muddy banks, their handlers shouting over the storm. Helicopters hovered, spotlights cutting wide arcs across the churning water. Divers suited up, their masks fogging in the damp night air, before plunging into water blackened by silt. Radios crackled with sharp commands. Floodlights lit the forest, casting long shadows that made the shoreline look even more haunted. Hope surged briefly when sonar equipment registered a faint outline beneath the water, 15 feet long, rectangular, a possible vehicle. Crowds on shore held their breath. Metal hooks were lowered, cables pulled taut. But when the object broke the surface, it was nothing more than a rusted barrel, long sunk into the lake bed. A collective sigh of despair swept through the crowd. Some wept openly. For the Monroes, it was another cruel silence, another night without their daughter. By the second day, the search began to feel less like rescue and more like ritual. Mr. Monroe sat on a wooden bench overlooking the water, motionless, as if his gaze alone might pull the car from the depths. Mrs. Monroe knelt in the mud, whispering her daughter's name into the void, her voice drowned by the storm. Cameras from local news stations captured the raw grief, the trembling hands, the hollow eyes. Those images made front pages across South Carolina, searing Ashley Monroe's name into the public conscience. Yet even with helicopters buzzing, dogs barking, and searchlights scouring every ripple, Lake Murray gave nothing back. The community, already shaken, began to realize this was no simple accident. Ashley hadn't just disappeared, she had been erased. And when a town cannot find answers in the water, it starts looking for them in people. If this night has already left you unsettled, stay with us. Because the storm is only the beginning, and in the next chapter, you'll see how suspicion can destroy lives in ways as cruel as any killer. Don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the truth hidden inside these true crime cases. The search for Ashley Monroe consumed Lexington County in the days following her disappearance. Patrol cars lined the lakeside road, engines humming in the storm's fading echoes. Dozens of volunteers moved shoulder to shoulder through soaked underbrush, flashlights cutting narrow tunnels through the darkness. Divers scoured the lakebed while helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights sweeping like desperate eyes. Every ripple, every rustle of branches carried the weight of possibility. But with each passing hour, hope began to erode. The lake remained silent, withholding answers. What it did not give, the community tried to create. And so, suspicion turned inward. People needed a name, a face, someone to carry the blame. It didn't take long for whispers to gather around Ethan Cole. Ethan had been Ashley's high school sweetheart. Their relationship stretched across years, familiar to everyone in the small community. But by late summer of 2000, the romance had soured. They broke up, bitterly, and within weeks Ethan was seen at parties with someone new. Arguments spilled over the phone. Neighbors overheard shouting. For investigators, desperate for leads, Ethan was the easiest answer. On the fourth day, detectives brought him in. Under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, Ethan sat across from seasoned investigators, his hands folded, his face pale. The questions came in waves. Where were you that night? Did you see Ashley after the call? Why did neighbors hear fighting? Ethan admitted to arguing with Ashley over the phone earlier in the evening. His voice cracked as he insisted. Yes, we fought. But I never saw her that night. I swear. 12 hours passed in that interrogation room. Outside, reporters circled like vultures. By evening, the story broke. Ex-boyfriend questioned an Ashley Monroe case. The headline was enough. Suspicion solidified into assumption. In coffee shops, people shook their heads knowingly. Jealousy. He must have snapped. Old classmates whispered, he always had a temper. Neighbors avoided his family. His new girlfriend's car was vandalized, the word murderer scrawled in crude red paint. Ethan was suspended from his part-time job. By the end of the week, he had become the villain in Lexington's collective imagination. What unfolded was not just an investigation, it was a trial by public opinion. Psychologists call it cognitive closure, the human need to end uncertainty by grabbing onto the most available explanation. And the media, eager for headlines, fed that hunger. To a frightened community, Ethan fit the archetype. The jealous ex, the rejected lover. It didn't matter that evidence was thin. What mattered was the story made sense. But reality has little patience for convenience. A week later, a security camera at an ATM in downtown Greenville, nearly 10 miles from where Ashley vanished, revealed Ethan withdrawing money at the exact time she disappeared. The footage was grainy but conclusive. He couldn't have been at Lake Murray. His alibi was airtight. When police cleared him, the announcement landed like a bomb. The community that had branded him guilty now had to swallow its own haste. The same newspapers that printed bold accusations now ran cautious retractions. But the damage was done. Ethan's reputation was shattered. He had been interrogated, accused, paraded across front pages, and condemned by neighbors. Though free, he was scarred. For the Monroe family, Ethan's exoneration reopened the void. Their daughter was still missing. The true predator was still free. And the town, chastened by its mistake, grew quieter, more fearful. If the obvious suspect was innocent, then the real answer was hidden deeper, perhaps closer to home than anyone dared admit. The psychology of this moment is critical. Communities under fear grasp for narratives. They prefer a villain they know over the terror of an unknown hunter. The media, driven by urgency, amplifies that instinct. But in doing so, they risk what happened here, destroying an innocent life while the guilty one walks untouched. For investigators, the Ethan misstep left a permanent scar. It revealed how bias can steer justice off course. It showed how desperation warps judgment, how rumor solidifies into fact, and how dangerous it is when evidence plays second to speculation. In the weeks that followed, the search dwindled. The volunteers went home. Helicopters stopped circling. The lake returned to stillness. But the void remained, echoing with unanswered questions. Where was Ashley? Who had followed her that night? And why had the community been so quick to choose the wrong villain? This turning point was more than an error. It was a warning. Without patience, without precision, without evidence, justice becomes theater. And theater can destroy as completely as violence itself. This case is already unraveling how fragile justice can be. If you believe we must look beyond rumors to find the truth, don't forget to subscribe. And tell me in the comments if this story has you hooked. Type 1. If not, type 0. Because your voice helps shape which true crime cases we bring to light next. Ethan's release left the community stunned. For a moment, it seemed the case had collapsed into silence, a void where suspicion had failed and evidence refused to speak. But just as Lexington County began to adjust to the uncomfortable truth that Ashley's disappearance remained unsolved, an unexpected message arrived, delivered not by police, but by the predator himself. It came 2 years after that stormy night, on an ordinary morning in 2002. The Monroe family opened their mailbox to find a small brown parcel. No return address, no sender's name, just their family written across the top in hurried black ink. At first, they assumed it was a neighborly gesture, perhaps a sympathy card sent long after the tragedy. But when Mr. Monroe carried it inside, something about its weight felt wrong. Inside the package lay a silver bracelet, delicate, engraved with the name Ashley. It was caked in mud, its once polished surface dulled by grime. The faint stench of motor oil clung to the cardboard and seeped into the paper wrapping. "Mrs. Monroe let out a scream that seemed to tear the air in two. She collapsed to the floor, clutching the bracelet as though it were a piece of her daughter's soul returned from the abyss. Detectives swarmed the Monroe home within hours. The parcel was sealed in the evidence bags. Forensic technicians examined every inch. They confirmed the bracelet was Ashley's, the very one she wore every day, the kind of accessory that becomes almost part of a person's identity. But the real message was not in the object itself. It was in the act of sending it. Investigators recognized the behavior as classic predator signaling. This was not a trophy hidden away in secret. This was a communication, deliberate and cruel. The mud suggested it had been stored in damp conditions, perhaps outdoors, before being mailed. The motor oil stains hinted at mechanical or construction work. To detectives, it was as though the perpetrator had written a taunt in invisible ink. "I control the story. I control your grief. I am close enough to touch your lives whenever I choose." For the Monroe family, the delivery was more than evidence. It was psychological torture. It proved Ashley's killer was not a faceless stranger in another state. He was near. He walked the same streets, used the same post office, lived within miles of their home. Mrs. Monroe began sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every knock on the door. Mr. Monroe sat guard by the window each night, shotgun across his lap, staring out into the dark yard, waiting for shadows that never revealed themselves. The town, already on edge, spiraled into paranoia. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Whispers grew louder. Who had access to Ashley's things? Who worked with oil and machinery? The mail carrier himself became the subject of rumor, until police confirmed he had no connection. Fear mutated into gossip, gossip into mistrust. From a psychological perspective, this act revealed a chilling profile. The killer didn't simply want to erase Ashley. He wanted to rewrite the narrative, to inject himself into the family's grief, to remind the community that he was still out there, unseen, unpunished, and powerful. He was playing a game of control, savoring their suffering like a second crime. Detective Caldwell, years later, would describe the package as the moment the case stopped being about a disappearance and became about a predator. Because no accident leaves behind staged reminders. No random tragedy mails back its victim's jewelry. Only someone who relishes power does that. The package did not bring answers. It brought terror. It confirmed that the lake had not taken Ashley by chance. It had been used as a grave by someone who still walked among them. And with that package, Lexington County realized the truth. This was not simply a girl lost to a storm. This was a hunter hiding in plain sight, reminding everyone he could strike again. If this part chills you as much as it chilled the Monroes, don't let the story end here. Subscribe now so you never miss the next piece of evidence. And tell me below, type 1 if you think the killer's message was arrogance, or 0 if you think it was fear disguised as control. Your comments help us uncover which true crime cases deserve the spotlight next. The package marked a turning point. It was no longer a case of a missing college student. It was the haunting of a family and a community. But after the shock subsided, after the bracelet was bagged and cataloged, the investigation once again slowed. Leads evaporated, suspects fell away, and the silence thickened like fog over Lake Murray. For the Monroes, silence was unbearable. Mrs. Monroe began to shrink into herself. Once active in the local church choir, she stopped attending. She spent hours in Ashley's empty room, sitting on the bed, clutching the pillow as if it still held her daughter's scent. She kept the blinds drawn, unable to face the daylight without Ashley in it. Her grief followed a cruel cycle, moments of numbness, followed by piercing breakdowns, and then the crushing realization that nothing had changed. Mr. Monroe wore his grief differently. He became a sentinel. Neighbors often saw him sitting on the porch long after midnight, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the dark road that led to Lake Murray. Each car that passed sent a ripple through his chest. He was waiting, not just for his daughter to come home, but for the shadow he believed had stolen her. The wider community, however, could not carry that same weight forever. After months, then years, conversation about Ashley grew quieter. At first, her name was spoken in hushed tones in grocery stores and diners, but over time, it disappeared from daily talk. People avoided the subject, uncomfortable with a mystery that lingered unsolved. Lexington County chose self-preservation over remembrance. By 2003, newspaper coverage dwindled. Local stations moved on to fresher headlines. The police, with no new evidence, reduced the investigation to a skeleton team. Officially, Ashley's disappearance remained open. In practice, it had been shelved. The bracelet, once a terrifying clue, now sat in a labeled box in the evidence room, another relic gathering dust. Psychologists describe this phase as community amnesia. When tragedy cannot be resolved, people push it aside to protect their own sense of safety. To admit that Ashley's killer was still out there, still close, was to accept that danger lurked in every familiar face. So, the town chose denial. Mark Jennings, the neighbor with the unsettling stare, returned to church pews and grocery store aisles, shaking hands, smiling faintly, wearing the mask of normalcy. To some, he was no longer a suspect, but a victim of rumor. For the Monroes, this denial was its own form of betrayal. They watched their neighbors move on while their own lives froze in October of 2000. Mrs. Monroe grew ill from the weight of depression, her health slipping as the years dragged on. Mr. Monroe aged rapidly, his back stooped, his once black hair streaked with gray. Yet every evening, he returned to Lake Murray, sitting on an old wooden bench, staring out across the water. Some nights, he whispered Ashley's name into the waves. Others, he sat in silence, as if listening for the hum of a hidden engine beneath the lake. Volunteers who had once marched shoulder to shoulder during the search now passed him with sympathetic nods, but no conversation. A grieving father by the water became part of the landscape, an image both haunting and invisible. The years of silence were not neutral. They were corrosive. They eroded faith in the justice system, frayed the bond between neighbors, and left the Monroes trapped in an endless cycle of mourning. For them, the storm had never ended. And yet, silence does not mean peace. It means waiting. Beneath the surface of Lake Murray, beneath the polite smiles of neighbors, beneath the dust in the case file, something darker still pulsed. The killer had not disappeared. He had simply been absorbed back into the community's daily life, invisible in plain sight. For Ashley's parents, that knowledge never left. While the town forgot, they remembered every hour, every day, every year. Years turned into a decade, and for most of Lexington County, Ashley Monroe's disappearance had faded into a painful memory. But inside the sheriff's office, the case file remained, thick with contradictions, gathering dust on a shelf. By 2010, it was little more than a relic, another name on a long list of unsolved tragedies. Then came Ryan Caldwell. Caldwell was 30 years old when he transferred to the county's newly reinstated cold case unit. Unlike many veterans hardened by years of chasing dead ends, he carried a reputation for obsession with details. Colleagues said he was the kind of detective who noticed not just the crime scene, but the margin notes on the evidence log, the forgotten receipt stapled to the wrong page, the small things others dismissed. When Ashley's file landed on his desk, he didn't see a closed story. He saw a puzzle with missing pieces deliberately shoved into the wrong box. He began with the photographs. The original investigators had documented the lakeside scene. The tire tracks gouged into wet soil, the shattered phone glowing faintly in the mud, the single Nike shoe. But Caldwell noticed something others had glanced over. The tire marks were far wider than the Taurus Ashley drove. That meant at least one other vehicle had been there. Yet, in the final reports, the tracks had been dismissed as possibly unrelated. Eights. To Caldwell, that was more than sloppy. It was bias. The team, desperate for closure, had zeroed in on Ethan Cole, the ex-boyfriend. Every scrap of evidence that didn't fit the jealous ex narrative had been pushed aside. It wasn't an investigation. It was confirmation bias in uniform. As he dug deeper, Caldwell found more troubling details. Witness statements had been misfiled, some tucked into unrelated cases. A truck driver's account of two cars speeding side by side near the lake had been relegated to a footnote. Even worse, an audio recording of the anonymous female caller in 2008, who claimed the perpetrator was tied to construction work at Lake Murray, was gone. The system showed it had been logged. But the tape itself? Missing? Caldwell's hands trembled as he flipped through the envelopes. Was it clerical error, or had someone deliberately removed it? To him, it didn't matter. Either way, the mishandling had cost years. In true crime cases, evidence is oxygen. Once it's gone, the truth suffocates. He began to reassemble the puzzle piece by piece. The oil-stained package, the Nike shoe, the tire tracks, the missing jacket, the misfiled witness notes. On his office wall, he pinned them together with red string, not as a trope, but as a working theory. The picture that emerged was not of a jealous boyfriend, but of someone with knowledge of the lake, someone who understood how to make a car vanish beneath water, someone who wanted to taunt the family long after the crime. Again and again, one name surfaced: Mark Jennings, the quiet neighbor, the man who had sued the Monroes for defamation and walked away smiling. He had the proximity, the construction background, the opportunity. And yet, because the early case had collapsed under the weight of Ethan's false suspicion, Jennings had slipped back into the crowd, free and untouchable. Caldwell refused to accept that. He drafted an internal memo that was both respectful and searing. Initial investigation compromised by bias towards single suspect. Evidence overlooked, misfiled, or missing. Tire track analysis incompatible with victim's vehicle. Case must be re-examined from zero. Eights. His bluntness unsettled his superiors. Reopening Ashley Monroe's case meant stirring a community that had finally buried its fear. It meant asking questions about why evidence was lost. It meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that justice had been delayed not by mystery alone, but by human failure. But Caldwell was relentless. He requested new forensic testing on the plaster cast of the mysterious shoe print found near the lake. He petitioned for digital archiving of all remaining photographs before time degraded them further. He interviewed retired officers, pressing them on why leads had been dropped. Many shrugged, admitting the pressure from media and public opinion had forced them into narrowing their focus. As one veteran told him quietly, the town wanted a villain. Ethan was easy. Jennings was messy. Eights. To Caldwell, that was unacceptable. Cold cases weren't dead. They were buried alive. All it took was someone willing to dig. As he sat alone in the records room late one night, the storm tapping on the office window, Caldwell whispered to himself, "She didn't vanish. Someone erased her. And the evidence, they left it right here. We just refused to look." Eights. This wasn't just about Ashley anymore. It was about every family who had been told to accept silence as an answer. Every case shoved into a drawer because the truth was inconvenient. For Caldwell, Ashley Monroe's file became a personal vow. The mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Detective Caldwell's obsession proves one thing. Cold cases are never truly cold. They're waiting for someone to listen. If you want to see how patience and precision can bring justice back from the dead, hit subscribe. And tell me in the comments, type 1 if you believe revisiting old files is worth it, or 0 if you think the past should stay buried. Because in the world of true crime cases, your voice matters. By 2022, Caldwell's persistence had gathered enough momentum to force a decision. The sheriff's office, under renewed pressure, authorized a full-scale search of Lake Murray using modern technology. This time, they would not rely on the rudimentary sonar of 2000. They enlisted the help of a renowned civilian dive and recovery team, specialists who had solved hundreds of submerged vehicle cases across the country. The shoreline transformed into a command post. Police cruisers lined the dirt road. Floodlights bathed the water in pale beams. Reporters clustered behind barricades, cameras trained on the lake as if expecting it to confess. Families of other missing persons gathered too, hoping the depths might yield more than one secret. For the Monroes, now 2 decades older, this was not just an investigation. It was the last chance to bring their daughter home. Caldwell walked the site with calm precision, shaking hands with the divers, briefing his team. His voice was steady but low. "We get one shot. Let's make it count." The dive crew launched their boat, its hull slapping the ripples as it eased into the dark water. Inside the boat, the sonar monitor hummed to life. Blue waves rippled across the screen, mapping the lake bed with pulses of sound. At first, it was ordinary. Rocky outcrops, fallen trees, the silted remains of barrels. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence of the lake seemed determined to mock them again. Then the shape appeared. On the screen, at 60 feet down, a faint outline emerged. It was long, rectangular, about 15 feet in length, edges too straight to be natural. A diver leaned closer, tapping the screen. "That's no rock." The outline tilted at an odd angle, half buried in mud, with a protrusion resembling a hood. Caldwell's heart thudded. He leaned over the monitor, eyes fixed. He didn't allow himself to celebrate. Sonar can deceive. A concrete slab, a sunken dock, even a strange formation could mimic a vehicle. But deep inside, he felt the pulse of recognition. This was it. You're standing on the boat, staring at the glowing outline. Straight lines where nature should curve. Your breath catches. You know what you're seeing isn't debris. It's a car, and it has been waiting here for over 20 years. The divers prepared. Heavy suits were zipped, tanks secured, flashlights checked. Caldwell stood at the edge of the boat, watching them adjust their masks. The air around the crew was thick with anticipation. On shore, the Monroes clutched each other's hands, their eyes fixed on the dark water. 2 divers rolled backward into the lake. The surface foamed briefly before closing over them, leaving only ripples. On deck, the command team monitored their helmet cameras, screens glowing with murky greens and browns as the divers descended. The water grew darker with each foot. Branches jutted from the silt like skeletal arms. Clouds of mud swirled at the sweep of fins. Then, after long minutes, a metallic form began to materialize from the shadows. Rusted, algae-coated, but unmistakable. A car. One diver reached out and tapped the frame. A hollow metallic clank reverberated through the audio feed. Erasing any doubt, Caldwell, watching from the boat, clenched his fists. The divers swept their flashlights across the vehicle. A faded oval emblem glimmered faintly on the grille. Ford. This was Ashley Monroe's Taurus. They circled the car, cameras capturing every detail. The vehicle sat tilted nose down in the mud, windows clouded, doors sealed tight. The driver's side was caked in silt, the trunk half buried. For over 2 decades, it had rested here, holding its silence. Then, one diver paused, his beam catching something inside. He leaned closer, radioing up to the surface. "There's something in the back seat. Can't make it out." "Eights." The feed showed fragments, mud, fabric, perhaps more. Caldwell ordered them to proceed with care. The divers tried the rear door. It groaned, resistant, before yielding with a screech that echoed through the comms. A plume of black mud poured out like smoke. Inside, the light revealed a shocking sight. Torn family photographs, waterlogged but still recognizable. Ashley's face, her parents' faces, scratched and defaced as though by hateful hands. Onshore, when the images relayed, Mrs. Monroe collapsed, sobbing into her husband's chest. Reporters lowered their cameras, some visibly shaken. This was no accident. This was a message buried with the victim, meant to torment the family even from the depths. The divers secured cables around the chassis. On Caldwell's signal, the crane engine roared to life, steel groaning as it pulled. The lake foamed violently. Inch by inch, the Taurus rose from the black water, dripping mud, algae, and 22 years of secrets. When the car broke the surface, silence fell across the crowd. No cheers, no gasps, only the stunned quiet of truth revealed. A license plate was wiped clean, a perfect match to Ashley Monroe's registration. For the Monroes, it was both devastation and relief. Their daughter would never walk through the door, but at last, she had been found. For 2 decades, the lake held its silence. Now the truth has surfaced. If this discovery shook you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, and tell me in the comments, type 1 if you believe sonar technology is justice's hidden weapon, or 0 if you think some secrets should stay buried. In the world of true crime cases, your voice matters. The Ford Taurus sat on the shoreline, dripping black water and decades of silt. Officers cordoned off the area while forensic technicians in white suits moved in. The Monroes stood back, held upright only by grief and the arms of neighbors, as the car was sealed off with yellow tape. For 22 years, the vehicle had been a coffin. Now, it was a crime scene. When investigators pried open the doors, a stench rose that silenced everyone nearby. Inside lay bone fragments, scattered along the back seat, disjointed but unmistakable. Forensic anthropologists carefully collected each piece, later confirming through DNA that they belonged to Ashley Monroe. Alongside the bones was a faded navy blue jacket, clinging loosely to what remained of the seat frame. That detail, never made public, matched exactly what Henry Walker, the dying inmate, had described in his phone call. It was the first time in decades that a private truth had been confirmed by physical evidence. But the discoveries did not end there. In the glove compartment, buried under rust and muck, technicians found a small metal object. When cleaned, it revealed itself. A lighter, old and tarnished, but engraved with 2 letters, MJ. Caldwell's stomach clenched. He knew those initials instantly. Mark Jennings, the neighbor who had once leered from his porch, the man who had sued the Monroes for accusing him, the man who had slipped back into the community as if nothing had happened. To some, MJ could have been coincidence. To Caldwell, it was a signature, a mark of arrogance left behind, daring investigators to find it. Technicians moved methodically, bagging the lighter, photographing the jacket, cataloging every trace. They noted oil stains smeared across the trunk lining, the same oily residue once found on the mysterious package that contained Ashley's bracelet. Suddenly, fragments of the puzzle began to align. The package, once an unsolvable riddle, now looked like the killer's second crime scene. Caldwell, however, wanted more than coincidence. He revisited the plaster cast of the shoe print taken from the lakeside in 2000. Back then, the print had been dismissed because it didn't match Ashley's sneakers. Using modern forensic comparison, analysts compared it against 2 decades of footwear databases. The result was chilling. The print matched perfectly with a size 11 Timberland boot released in 1999, the exact style Mark Jennings was known to wear. Piece by piece, the mosaic sharpened. Caldwell next turned to paperwork. He sifted through old auto shop records from Columbia, hoping to find a trace of Jennings in the days following Ashley's disappearance. His persistence paid off. Buried in a stack of faded invoices was a slip dated October 15th, 2000, the morning after Ashley vanished. It recorded repairs on a vehicle registered to Mark Jennings. Chassis adjustment, repainting of scratched panels, and undercarriage work. The ink was faded but legible. For Caldwell, this was no longer circumstantial. The lighter with Jennings' initials, the Timberland boot print, the oil-stained trunk, and now the repair invoice, all of it converged. It painted the image of a man who had not only killed but carefully concealed his tracks, only to betray himself with arrogance and carelessness. Yet what unsettled Caldwell most was the psychology the evidence revealed. The torn family photos in the back seat weren't about concealment. They were about cruelty. They showed a man who wanted the Monroes to suffer, not just lose their daughter. The bracelet mailed to their home was another layer of torment. Jennings wasn't content to kill. He needed to control, to remind, to dominate. Psychological profiling aligned with this pattern. Offenders who return evidence to families, who stage symbolic items at a scene, often display traits of narcissism and sadism. They crave recognition for their power. They want the family, the community, and sometimes even law enforcement to feel their presence long after the crime. Jennings fit the profile perfectly. Socially withdrawn, quietly hostile, experienced with mechanical work, and intimately familiar with Lake Murray's landscape. As Caldwell compiled these findings, the case evolved from a puzzle to a portrait. Jennings had lived 2 houses down, blending into the community as a harmless loner. Yet beneath that facade was a predator who used construction knowledge to orchestrate a disappearance, submerged a vehicle to erase physical traces, and then mocked the family by returning their daughter's belongings. The forensic mosaic was damning. Ashley's remains, the navy blue jacket, the MJ lighter, the Timberland boot print, the repair slip. Each piece on its own raised suspicion. Together, they told a story no one could deny. Caldwell knew this was the turning point. For 22 years, Lexington County had lived under silence and rumor. Now, science, persistence, and psychology had shattered the mask. The lake gave up its secrets, and the evidence points to a neighbor hiding in plain sight. If this forensic mosaic leaves you chilled, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And share your thoughts in the comments. Type 1 if you believe the lighter was Jennings' fatal mistake, or 0 if you think it was arrogance disguised as chance. In the world of true crime cases, your perspective matters. By early 2023, the mosaic was complete. The lighter, the boot print, the repair slip, the jacket, and the bones, each piece had converged into a portrait of guilt that no one could deny. Caldwell prepared the file with meticulous care and presented it to Sheriff Bailey. After hours of tense review, the sheriff closed the folder, nodded once, and said, "It's time." 8. On a gray January morning, Lexington County deputies rolled silently down Jennings Street. Neighbors peeked from curtains as the convoy stopped before the weathered wooden house at the cul-de-sac. SWAT officers surrounded the property. Over a loudspeaker came the call. "Mark Jennings, you're under arrest for the murder of Ashley Monroe. Step outside Eights. The door creaked open. Jennings appeared, groggy, in an old sweater. Before he could protest, officers restrained him, cold cuffs snapping around his wrists. He muttered angrily, but his words were incoherent, swallowed by the metallic clink of chains. Neighbors, once convinced of his innocence, froze in shock. Some whispered, "I asked him to fix my porch," or "He watched my kids once." To see him led away as a killer was like watching a mask shatter. News spread instantly. Cameras captured Jennings' blank stare as he was escorted to a cruiser. Front pages screamed, "Lake Murray killer arrested after 22 years." In diners and shops, people who once defended him now recoiled, guilty for their silence. A week later, Ashley Monroe's funeral was held in a small Lexington church. Her white-draped coffin bore a framed graduation photo, Ashley in her cap and gown, smiling, forever 19. The congregation filled with classmates, professors, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the case for decades. Mrs. Monroe clutched her daughter's photograph, whispering through tears, "You're finally home." Mr. Monroe sat hunched, eyes fixed on the coffin, his face etched by years of waiting. The service became both closure and confession. Afterward, in hushed conversations, older neighbors admitted what they had seen years earlier. One recalled Jennings near the lake the night of the storm, a dark figure walking along the shoreline. Another remembered the roar of an engine followed by a crash, but fear of retaliation kept him silent. These details, withheld for decades, now spilled out in whispers of regret. This was bystander guilt, the burden of knowing something, however small, but choosing silence out of fear or convenience. For the Monroes, those confessions were bittersweet, proof that they had not been paranoid, but also a reminder that silence had cost them 22 years of torment. Psychologists describe bystander guilt as corrosive. Communities convince themselves they're powerless, but the silence itself protects the predator. In Lexington County, Jennings thrived in that silence, attending church, shaking hands, blending in. The neighbor's fear became his shield. For Caldwell, the funeral was more than a farewell. It was a lesson. Justice had not come through rumor, nor through hasty suspicion, but through patient reconstruction of facts. The community, however, had to reckon with its role in allowing the mask to hold for so long. As the Monroes placed flowers on their daughter's grave, Lexington County finally faced its collective failure. Jennings had not lived in shadows. He had lived among them, and silence had been his greatest ally. Jennings' arrest and Ashley's funeral brought closure, but also a haunting question. How many people stayed silent when they could have spoken? If you believe silence is as dangerous as the crime itself, hit subscribe so you never miss the truth behind these true crime cases. And in the comments, type 1 if you think neighbors should always speak out, or 0 if you understand their fear. Your voice matters. The arrest of Mark Jennings was only the beginning. In the spring of 2023, Lexington County prepared for the trial that would decide not just his fate, but the community's sense of justice after 2 decades of torment. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered daily, their microphones and cameras pointed toward the heavy oak doors. Banners on television called it the Lake Murray trial, turning a small-town courtroom into a stage for national scrutiny. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The front row belonged to the Monroes, frail, aged by grief, but resolute. Caldwell sat behind the prosecution table, his notes stacked neatly, every page a reminder of years spent piecing together the mosaic. Across from him, Jennings appeared in an orange jumpsuit, shackled, expression blank. His silence was chilling, not the silence of a man misunderstood, but the silence of one who believed he could outlast judgment forever. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the evidence in deliberate order, each piece like a hammer blow. First, the DNA confirming Ashley's remains. Next, the navy blue jacket, matching a detail never released publicly. Then the lighter engraved with MJ, a personal artifact found in the glove compartment of the submerged Ford Taurus. They showed the Timberland bootprint cast, modern forensics tying it directly to Jennings' boots from 1999. Finally, the repair slip, dated the morning after Ashley vanished, documenting adjustments and scratches on Jennings' vehicle. Each item, displayed before the jury, built a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The defense countered weakly. They argued the evidence was too old, degraded by decades underwater. They suggested the lighter might have been planted, that the bootprint could belong to anyone, that the repair slip was circumstantial. But the more they spoke, the more their arguments sounded like excuses straining against reality. Here, jury cognition played its role. Jurors are not scientists. They are storytellers at heart. They look for coherence, for a thread that ties facts into meaning. And Caldwell's case provided that thread. Every piece of evidence, every psychological clue, aligned to form a chillingly consistent portrait of Jennings. The defense offered fragments, but the prosecution offered a story. And in the courtroom, stories win. Witness testimony added emotional gravity. Ethan Cole, once vilified as the prime suspect, took the stand. He described how the community's rush to judgment had destroyed his life, forcing him to live under suspicion for years. His presence reminded jurors of the dangers of bias and how different Jennings' case was. Here, the evidence didn't rest on rumor. It rested on facts, science, and time that had finally caught up with the predator. Then came the most haunting moment. David Jennings, Mark's brother, testified about a night in 2000 when Mark came home drunk, muttering to himself. She screamed too loud. The courtroom fell silent, every juror's eyes fixed on the witness. That single sentence, delivered decades later, resonated louder than any forensic chart. By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom felt heavy, as if everyone was bracing for a long-awaited storm. The prosecutor addressed the jury plainly. Coincidences do not stack like this. A lighter with his initials, a boot print that matches his shoes, a repair slip the morning after, a jacket no one else knew existed, and bones in the car at the bottom of Lake Murray. This is not chance. This is murder. 8. The jury deliberated for 2 days. In that span, Lexington County held its breath. At coffee shops, people argued over the evidence. In church pews, neighbors prayed for the Monroes. And in their home, the parents sat side by side, waiting for a verdict that might finally close the wound carved into their lives. When the jury returned, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The 4 persons stood, voice steady but waited. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Jennings, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Ashley Monroe. 8. The words rippled through the room like a wave. Mrs. Monroe wept openly, clutching her husband's hand. Mr. Monroe bowed his head, trembling not from sorrow this time, but from the fragile relief of justice finally delivered. Caldwell closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, the years of frustration dissolving into quiet vindication. The judge's gavel struck. Jennings was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He remained impassive, jaw clenched, refusing even then to acknowledge the life he had stolen. But his silence no longer had power. For Lexington County, the verdict was more than punishment. It was closure, narrative closure, the transformation of a mystery into a story with an ending. Jurors left knowing they had not only judged a man, but rewritten the community's history. Ashley Monroe could never return, but her memory had been reclaimed from the lake's depths. And for her parents, the long vigil was over. They could finally place flowers on her grave with the knowledge that truth had spoken. On October 14th, 2000, a storm raged over Lexington County, South Carolina. Lightning slashed the sky above Lake Murray, and rain pounded the lonely road like iron nails. At 11, VU0P, M. A trucker caught a glimpse through his windshield. A silver Ford Taurus tearing through the downpour. Another pair of headlights locked behind it. Too close. Too deliberate. Minutes later, 19-year-old Ashley Monroe, a freshman at the University of South Carolina, made a frantic call to her best friend. Her trembling voice carried only a few words. "Someone's following me." Then came the screech of metal, a strangled cry, and silence. The line went dead, swallowed by the storm. By dawn, her bed at home was untouched, her phone unanswered. Along the lakeside road, police found a shattered cell phone glowing weakly in the mud, tire tracks swerving toward the water, and a single white Nike shoe, fresh, small, and unmistakably Ashley's. Helicopters combed the shoreline. Divers plunged into black water. But Lake Murray offered nothing back. No body. No car. Only silence. And silence has power. In the days that followed, suspicion spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered, newspapers screamed, and police chased shadows. An innocent man's life was destroyed by rumors, while the real predator stayed hidden in plain sight. This case would not fade. 2 years later, a brown package appeared in the Monroe family mailbox. Inside lay Ashley's silver bracelet, caked in mud, reeking of oil, like a message from the darkness. "I'm still here." For over 2 decades, this community lived under that shadow, until one detective reopened the file and forced the lake to finally reveal its secret. A rusted car, a navy blue jacket never made public, and a clue marked with 2 simple letters changed everything. This is not just a disappearance. It is one of America's most haunting true crime cases, a storm, a lake, and a neighbor who lived 2 houses away. Subscribe now, stay with us, and don't let Lake Murray's silence bury the truth again.